Imagine, just for a second, that you're stepping onto the flight deck of an Airbus A320.
Oh man, that is a very specific feeling.
Right. You slide into the jump seat right behind the captain and the first officer, and that heavy reinforced door clicks shut behind you.
Sealing you in with the low hum of those avionics cooling fans.
Exactly. You're looking at this endless wraparound array of glowing screens in the dim light, and you are looking right over the shoulders of these highly trained A320 pilots. Welcome to your deep dive.
It's a great setup for what we're looking at today.
Yeah, we have a really unique set of source material this time. We are looking at a specialized instructor briefing.
Right, so this isn't, a glossy brochure for passengers.
Not at all. This is a gritty, highly technical training breakdown specifically focused on a critical and honestly fascinating aircraft system, the autothrust.
It is a remarkable piece of engineering.
Mm.
I mean, it's essentially the invisible hand in the cockpit. Modern aviation relies heavily on these automated systems, and for good reason. They are incredibly reliable. But the focus of this instructor briefing, and really the core of our conversation today, isn't just about what buttons the pilots push when the skies are clear.
Right, when everything is fine.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
It is about understanding the underlying logic. We are exploring why the aircraft is designed to react the way it does when things don't go according to plan.
To keep everyone safe, basically.
Yeah, absolutely.
The briefing points out right away that everyday use of the autothrust is second nature to A320 pilots. Like, it's pure muscle memory.
Sure.
But our mission today is to explore the invisible tug-of-war between human pilots and aircraft automation.
Which is a huge topic.
Huge. Because when abnormal situations pop up on that flight deck, things with intense names like thrust lock or alpha floor.
Those are intimidating names for sure.
They really are. And when they happen, that comfortable muscle memory has to instantly be replaced by a deep, almost instinctual understanding of the machine. So what does this all mean? We are transitioning from just pressing buttons to actually understanding the philosophy of flight deck automation.
I love that. And to understand that philosophy, you really have to start with how the system is supposed to work when nothing is going wrong.
The baseline normal.
Right.
Yeah.
In normal day-to-day operations, the autothrust is either disconnected, armed, or active. And when it is active, it operates within a very specific physical range on the thrust levers.
Those are the big throttle handles right in the center console.
Yeah, exactly. The autothrust lives between the idle position, which is pulled all the way back, and what's called the climb detent.
A detent being like a physical notch or a hard click in the track that the thrust lever slides along.
Precisely. So the pilot physically pushes the levers forward until they feel them click right into that climb detent. And from that point on, the autothrust takes over the actual engine power management.
It's active.
Right. It's actively managing the speed. And if an engine happens to be out, the briefing notes it's active between idle and flex MCT.
Which stands for maximum continuous thrust.
Exactly. But the brilliant part is really how the pilot overrides it.
Oh yeah, this part is cool. If they suddenly need more power, say, to avoid some nasty weather or something, they just push those cyclical levers past the climb position, boom.
Instant manual control.
Yeah, the engines rapidly deliver the requested thrust, but the auto thrust system doesn't completely turn off, right?
No, it doesn't. It just shifts to an armed status. It sits there quietly in the background, waiting for the pilot to pull the levers back into that climb detent so it can take over the workload again.
It's just hanging out, ready to jump back in.
It's a very seamless handoff in that normal operational range. It's designed to be totally intuitive. However, the briefing places a massive emphasis on a core principle for these instructors to drill into their trainees.
Which is?
Engaging the autothrust does not mean it's time to take a mental nap.
Right, you can't just check out.
Exactly. The pilot is still the one flying the airplane. They have a strict, non-negotiable responsibility to regularly monitor the autothrust's performance on their screens.
And if it fails?
If the system fails to maintain the selected speed for any reason, the pilot must intervene. They have to disconnect the system and manually take over the thrust.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because turning the system off is where the mechanics get really tricky. It is not like flipping a light switch in your living room or, turning off the cruise control in a normal car.
Not at all.
The briefing details the exact procedure, and it hinges on the instinctive disconnect push button.
Which are the red buttons located right on the side of the thrust levers themselves.
Right.
The placement of those red buttons is highly intentional. When a pilot's hand is resting on the levers, their thumb or finger falls naturally right onto that button.
So it's designed for immediate reflexive action.
It is. But the procedure for actually pressing it is where the nuance lies. And it requires a bit of background on how the A320 is physically built.
Because there is a major gotcha here, and it has to do with how the levers look versus what they are actually doing.
Yeah, this is a huge point of confusion sometimes.
Right, because on some older aircraft or planes from other manufacturers, the physical thrust levers are motorized. When the computer changes the engine speed, the levers physically move back and forth on their own, like ghost levers.
Yeah, it's actually pretty wild to watch.
But on the A320, they don't do that. When the autothrust is engaged in flying the plane, those physical thrust levers are just sitting stationary up in that climb detent notch.
Right, they aren't physically moving to match what the engines are doing under the hood.
Exactly. So imagine you are driving a car up a steep hill with the cruise control set to 65 miles per hour. The engine is working hard, revving high to maintain that speed against gravity. Now imagine your physical foot is just resting lightly on the gas pedal, barely pressing it at all.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
If you suddenly switch off the cruise control, the car is going to violently lurch and lose speed, right? Because your foot isn't matching the actual fuel demand the engine needs at that exact millisecond.
That is a perfect visualization. The car jerks because there's a sudden disconnect between the automated demand and the physical input.
Right. Applying that to the A320, if the pilot just pushes that red disconnect button immediately, while the physical lever is still sitting up in that climb detent.
Oh, the plane is going to suddenly surge forward to climb thrust.
Right, regardless of what the engines were actually doing a second ago.
Yes, absolutely. And the briefing explicitly warns instructors to train against this exact scenario. If a pilot just impulsively presses the button, they will command an unexpected and potentially destabilizing thrust increase.
Which you definitely don't want.
No, you don't. The aircraft's physical feedback loop demands that the pilot syncs up their manual controls with the automated reality before they take over.
So the pilot has to essentially slide their physical foot on the gas pedal to perfectly match what the cruise control is doing before they turn the cruise control off.
That's the exact analogy, yeah.
But how do they actually know where to put the levers if the levers haven't been moving?
They rely on the visual cues right in front of them on their engine displays. Specifically, the pilot must physically pull the thrust levers backward out of the climb detent to match the current actual engine thrust.
Okay.
They do this by watching a specific digital marker on their screen called the blue thrust lever position symbol. They pull the levers back until that blue symbol sits exactly in front of the current thrust needle.
So the blue symbol is the plane's way of saying, hey, my digital brain is currently putting out this much power. Please move your physical hand to this exact spot before you take over.
Precisely. It bridges the gap between the stationary levers and the dynamic engines.
That makes so much sense.
And only then, once those digital symbols are perfectly aligned, does the pilot press that red instinctive disconnect push button. That sequence hands control back to them smoothly, without any sudden jerks in engine power, keeping the passenger cabin comfortable and the flight path stable.
And then as a final cleanup step, they press that same red push button a second time, just to clear the auto thrust off memo from their alert screens.
Yeah, it's just good housekeeping.
It is a deliberate, choreographed little dance. Pull the lever back, match the blue symbol to the needle, press the red button, press it again. It makes total sense why the briefing says this needs to become pure instinct.
It has to be muscle memory.
But that careful, planned disconnection leads us to a slightly more terrifying thought. What happens if the pilot doesn't choose to disconnect it nicely? What if the system just quits entirely? Or, as the briefing mentions, what if a button on the main autopilot control panel is pressed by error?
That introduces a highly specific condition known in the A320 as thrust lock.
Thrust lock.
Yeah. If the autothrust disconnects unexpectedly, whether due to an internal computer failure or an erroneous button press, the engines don't just shut down and they don't surge to maximum.
What do they do?
Instead, the engine thrust literally freezes at its exact current value. And the system ensures the pilots know this is happening. The words thrust lock will appear flashing on their primary flight displays and their central electronic warning screens.
Okay, I have to push back on this a little.
Go for it.
Because, from the outside looking in, freezing the engines at whatever random thrust setting they happen to be at sounds incredibly dangerous.
I could see why you'd think that.
Put yourself back in that jump seat. If you are in the middle of a steep descent and the engines freeze at a high thrust setting, or you are climbing and they freeze at a low setting, you have a massive problem. Why on earth is locking the engines considered a good idea by these engineers?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the engineering philosophy behind thrust lock is actually a brilliant safety net.
How so?
Think about the alternative scenario. If the autothrust system suddenly failed and the engineers had programmed the engines to default to, say, idle thrust,
Oh, wow.
you would experience a massive, instantaneous loss of power. The aircraft would immediately start losing altitude or speed rapidly. That is a critical emergency, especially if you are low to the ground or in a crowded airspace.
The bottom would just drop out. You'd go from a controlled flight path to basically tossing a brick out a window.
And that's exactly why freezing the thrust is the lesser of two evils. By locking the thrust at its last known valid state, the system is maintaining continuous energy.
Okay, that changes things.
It is essentially buying the human pilot's time. The aircraft's computer is effectively communicating, look, I don't know what you want me to do next because my automated link is broken, so I'm just going to hold exactly what I'm doing right now while you evaluate the situation.
That reframes it completely. It is not a malfunction of the engines. It is a holding pattern for the power. It's hitting the pause button on thrust changes so the humans can catch up.
Exactly.
So how do the pilots unpause it? What is the physical fix for thrust lock?
Well, it depends on the root cause. If the message popped up simply because someone mistakenly bumped the autothrust push button on the center panel, the fix is trivial. Just press the button again to re-engage the system.
Just turn it back on.
Right. But if it is a genuine system failure and the automation is completely gone, the pilot has to physically intervene. They must move the physical thrust levers.
And this is where the mechanical elegance of the A320 really shines in the briefing. It points out that as soon as the pilot physically grabs those thrust levers and moves them, even just a fraction of an inch,
The engine thrust immediately unlocks.
just like that. The moment it unlocks, the engines instantly target whatever position the pilot is moving the levers to.
Yes.
By simply gripping the levers and shifting them, the pilot breaks the digital lock and regains total, raw manual control.
It forces the pilot directly into the control loop. It guarantees that before the thrust changes from that frozen, predictable, safe state, a human hand is physically directing the new power setting.
That's brilliant.
It is. But while thrust lock is designed to protect the aircraft against a sudden loss of its automation, there is another system detailed in this briefing designed to protect the aircraft when the physical limits of flight itself are being pushed too far.
This is where we get to the really intense stuff, the ultimate safety net.
Yeah, this one is serious.
The briefing calls it Alpha Floor, and it sounds like a protocol out of a sci-fi movie. Alpha Floor is the aircraft's absolute, non-negotiable protection mode against flying at a dangerously low speed with low thrust.
Yes. Alpha in aviation refers to the angle of attack.
Okay.
To visualize it, think about the angle at which the wing is meeting the oncoming relative wind. There are tiny physical sensors on the outside of the aircraft's nose, little vanes that look almost like weather vanes that constantly measure this invisible airflow.
They just sit out there feeling the wind.
Exactly. And if the nose of the plane is pulled up too high and the forward speed is too low, the air can no longer flow smoothly over the wings. The wings will eventually lose lift, resulting in an aerodynamic stall.
The plane will literally begin to fall.
Right.
So if those sensors on the nose detect that the aircraft's angle of attack is exceeding a critical threshold, if it hits that invisible alpha floor, the plane's computer decides it has had enough. It completely takes over.
Completely overrides the humans.
The briefing states that regardless of where the pilot currently has the physical thrust levers positioned, even if the human has them pulled all the way back to idle, the system overrides them. It activates autothrust automatically and instantly commands TOGA thrust.
TOGA standing for takeoff go-around thrust. It is the absolute maximum safe thrust available from those engines.
Max power.
Max power. The aircraft recognizes a life-threatening loss of lift, and it is essentially throwing everything it has at the problem, raw power, to muscle its way out of the stall condition and force air back over the wings.
The plane senses you are falling out of the sky, and it floods the engines with maximum power right that second.
It saves itself.
But here's where it gets really interesting. What happens after the aircraft is saved? The plane powers out of the low-speed situation, the angle of attack comes back down to a safe level, and the alpha floor condition is resolved. The aerodynamic emergency is over.
Right, you're flying normally again.
But the engines don't just quiet down. The primary flight display starts flashing a bright amber box with the words TOGA LK.
What's fascinating here is that TOGA LK is a persistent, blaring reminder to the flight crew. The plane has successfully saved itself from a stall, but as a result, those engines are now screaming at maximum takeoff go-around power, and they are locked there.
Locked there.
The system will not reduce that thrust no matter what the plane's speed is doing.
It's like the plane is flooded with adrenaline. It fought for its life. The threat is gone, but its heart rate is still pegged at 200 beats per minute, and it just can't calm itself down.
That's exactly what it is, a mechanical adrenaline rush. And it's a very deliberate design choice by Airbus.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the aircraft will not reduce that maximum power on its own because it needs the pilot to acknowledge the severity of what just occurred. To unlock it, the pilot must deliberately and manually disconnect the autothrust. They have to physically intervene, just like we discussed earlier, matching the levers, pressing the instinctive disconnect button on the throttle.
They have to prove to the computer that they are awake.
They have to prove they are consciously back in control of the aircraft. They have to demonstrate that they recognize they just triggered an extreme emergency system and that they are ready to manage the thrust manually before they can even think about re-engaging the normal, comfortable, automated systems. It is a forced psychological reset for the crew.
A forced psychological reset. Think about the reality of that cockpit. If you just experienced an alpha floor event, things are probably incredibly chaotic. Alarms are blaring, the G-forces have shifted violently, your own adrenaline is through the roof.
Oh, it would be terrifying.
You might actually need that forced physical action to ground yourself and say, okay, I have the plane. But that force reset raises a huge philosophical question for aviation engineers.
Where does the automation stop?
Exactly. If the plane is smart enough to detect a stall and save itself with maximum thrust, why isn't it smart enough to calm itself down afterward? Well, it turns out the newest generation of aircraft actually are.
Yes. The briefing doesn't just stick to the older A320 logic. It deliberately contrasts the standard we just discussed with the newer aircraft standards. And it uses the Airbus A350 as the prime example of how this underlying philosophy of automation is shifting.
On the A320, after an alpha floor save, you get stuck into a J-lock and the engines scream until the pilot physically intervenes. But on the newer standard, visualized with the A350, it handles the exact same life or death alpha floor scenario completely differently.
Completely differently.
There is no TOGA lock at all.
Now, the initial safety net is identical. The aircraft still uses those nose sensors to detect the dangerous angle of attack. It still automatically overrides the pilot. It still immediately applies maximum TOGA thrust to save the plane.
So the save is the same.
That critical life-saving intervention remains exactly the same.
But the aftermath is entirely different. Once the A350 is safely out of the high angle of attack situation, once the speed is back up, the nose is down, and the wings have lift, the autothrust simply automatically disengages itself.
It just turns off.
It quietly returns to whatever the initial status was before the emergency started. So if the pilot was flying in manual thrust right before the alpha floor triggered, the plane saves itself and then just seamlessly hands manual thrust back to the pilot.
It cleans up its own mess. It resolves the aerodynamic emergency and resets the engine thrust without demanding that mandatory manual physical intervention to break a lock.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here.
Let's hear it.
I completely understand that the newer system is smoother and technologically more advanced. But doesn't automatically resolving the issue without forcing that manual pilot reset risk making the flight crew dangerously complacent? I mean, if the plane fixes a near-stall condition and then just quietly goes back to manual thrust, couldn't a highly stressed, task-saturated crew potentially miss the transition? Doesn't the loud, screaming TOGA lock of the A320 force a necessary, undeniable awareness that the newer, quieter system might lack?
This raises an important question, and it is at the very heart of human-machine interface design in modern cockpits. The debate between forcing pilot awareness versus actively managing pilot workload.
Right.
The instructor briefing specifically notes that this new, fully automated management with the latest standards is designed primarily to significantly reduce crew workload.
But how does avoiding one button press reduce workload that much?
Well, it's deeper than just the physical button press. It's about cognitive overload. In a high-stress recovery situation, like an alpha floor event, or master warnings are sounding, the aircraft pitch has changed drastically. Air traffic control might be calling, and the pilots are experiencing physical tunnel vision.
It's sensory overload.
Exactly. The crew is already saturated with information and tasks. Having the aircraft seamlessly return to normal operations allows the pilots to immediately focus their remaining mental bandwidth on the most important things: flying the aircraft, stabilizing their flight path, and navigating away from terrain.
They aren't distracted by an alarm.
Right. They don't have to expend precious seconds diagnosing an amber-flashing TOGA LK box and performing a specific manual thrust matching sequence on top of everything else.
It's a fundamental shift in trust. It's about trusting the pilots to monitor the state of the aircraft through their primary instruments, rather than the aircraft holding the engines hostage until the pilot pays the ransom of a specific button press.
That's a great way to put it.
The new system assumes the pilot knows they just almost stalled the plane, so they don't need the engine screaming at them to remind them of their mistake.
The design philosophy shifts from "I must force the pilot to act so I know they are paying attention" to "I will handle the thrust emergency completely so the pilot can focus on the bigger picture of keeping the plane in the sky."
That distinction really brings this entire briefing into focus. Let's synthesize all of this, because what we've been looking at today is essentially a masterclass on how A320 pilots interact with the invisible hand of their autothrusts.
It really is.
The core message for instructors training these crews is simple but profound. Pilots must first fully understand the mechanical reality of the situation before they apply the correct actions in the right order.
Because without that deep understanding, when things go wrong, you are just blindly pushing buttons and hoping the computer sorts it out.
Exactly. Whether it's carefully matching the digital blue symbol to the thrust needle so you don't violently surge the engines during a normal disconnect, or whether it's understanding that you have to physically snap the levers out of position to break a thrust lock.
Or knowing how to manually calm down a TOGA lock after the plane saves itself.
Knowledge of the why is what prevents deadly surprises on the flight deck. And this is why pilots never really stop studying. They live with their nose in these massive technical Bibles, the operating and training manuals, because this stuff is far too complex to just wing it on muscle memory alone.
The learning never stops, and as we look at how these systems are evolving, it leaves you with a really compelling thought about the future of aviation.
Oh, yeah.
We've seen the transition from an aircraft that stubbornly locks its controls to force a pilot's awareness, like that screaming TOGA lock on the A320, to the newer standards on the A350 that seamlessly fix the problem and quietly tidy up in the background.
It is a massive leap.
It is. If planes are now cleaning up their own extreme emergencies so seamlessly, it makes you wonder what happens to the next generation of pilots who never have to manage the loud, terrifying warnings of the past.
Wow, yeah.
As this automation becomes more sophisticated, subtly taking the wheel and refusing to let the human fail, are we engineering out the very experience and raw stick and rudder skills required to fly the aircraft when all the computers finally quit?